Zion Velasquez never imagined that his perfect marriage to Nevaeh Solace would shatter in the most humiliating way possible. But on a quiet evening, in the dim glow of a stranger's window, he watched the woman he had vowed to love betray him in the arms of the one man he had trusted the most, Pastor Mercer Cain. At that moment, Zion wasn't just a husband scorned. He became a man with a singular purpose: revenge. And when it was over, neither of them would ever recover from the price they would pay. Zion Fletcher had always believed in love, loyalty, and faith. Raised in a religious household, he was taught that marriage was sacred, a bond meant to last forever. When he met Nevaeh, it felt like divine intervention. She was everything he had prayed for: beautiful, kind, and devoted to the church. Their love blossomed quickly, and within a year, Zion proposed. Nevaeh accepted without hesitation, and their wedding became the event of the year in their small town. Family, friends, and nearly the entire congregation gathered to celebrate. Their union, led by the charismatic pastor Tobias Mercer, a man Zion had long admired. The wedding was nothing short of perfection. The grand church was filled with flowers, and the choir sang hymns that made the moment feel almost holy. As Nevaeh walked down the aisle in her elegant white gown, Zion felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He promised himself that he would be the best husband, providing her with love, security, and anything her heart desired. When Pastor Mercer spoke about the sanctity of marriage, Zion listened intently, nodding in agreement. He had no idea that the very man preaching about faithfulness would soon shatter his world. After the wedding, Zion and Nevaeh settled into their new life together. Their home was a cozy 2-story house, a gift from Zion's hard work as a financial analyst. He took pride in creating a comfortable life for them, ensuring Nevaeh never lacked anything. She, in turn, seemed to be the perfect wife, cooking his favorite meals, leaving him sweet notes, and always greeting him with a warm smile. Their evenings were spent in laughter, watching movies, and planning their future. Zion couldn't have been happier. One of the things he loved most about Nevaeh was her devotion to the church. She attended every Sunday service without fail, often volunteering for church events. Her admiration for Pastor Mercer was evident, but Zion thought nothing of it. After all, Mercer had been a spiritual mentor to both of them, guiding them through premarital counseling and offering wisdom whenever they needed it. It wasn't unusual for Nevaeh to spend extra hours at the church, helping organize fundraisers, leading prayer groups, and assisting in youth programs. Zion admired her dedication, believing it was a sign of her strong faith. Everything seemed perfect, but small, almost unnoticeable changes began to creep into their lives. At first, Zion brushed them off as nothing more than the adjustments of newlyweds settling into marriage. Nevaeh started coming home later than usual, claiming church responsibilities were piling up. She became more protective of her phone, tilting the screen away whenever he walked by. When he asked about her day, she gave vague answers, quickly changing the subject. Zion reassured himself that she was simply busy, but a nagging feeling began to grow inside him. One evening, as Zion went to the laundry room to grab a fresh shirt, he noticed something unusual. In the pocket of one of Nevaeh's jackets, he found an elegant bracelet, one he had never seen before. Turning it over, he saw an engraving on the back, the initials TM. His stomach tightened. Tobias Mercer. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a church gift, a token of appreciation for her volunteer work. Still, something about it didn't sit right with him. Over the next few weeks, Zion began paying closer attention. He started noticing how Nevaeh's eyes lit up when Mercer spoke during sermons, how she lingered after services, always finding a reason to stay behind. When he casually mentioned Mercer's name, she seemed tense, almost nervous. His mind raced with possibilities, but he refused to jump to conclusions. He had promised to trust her, to build their marriage on faith. But faith alone wouldn't silence the growing doubt inside him. Zion tried to push away the doubts creeping into his mind, but the more he observed Nevaeh, the harder it became to ignore the unsettling changes in her behavior. What once felt like small, harmless shifts now seemed like glaring red flags. She was no longer the same woman who greeted him eagerly when he walked through the door. The warmth in her eyes had faded, replaced by a distant look that made him feel like a stranger in his own home. She was distracted, constantly checking her phone, smiling at messages she never shared. When he asked who she was texting, she would casually brush him off, saying it was church business or one of her friends. Yet, her phone was never left unattended. She carried it everywhere, even into the bathroom. At first, Zion convinced himself he was imagining things. He told himself that Nevaeh was just adjusting to marriage, that maybe she was stressed from handling church activities. But when she started dressing differently, wearing outfits that seemed more suited for a date than a prayer meeting, his suspicions deepened. He noticed how she took extra care with her makeup, spritzed herself with perfume before leaving, and always seemed in a hurry to get out of the house. When he playfully asked if she was dressing up for him, she only laughed and avoided answering. Then came the nights she started coming home late. She always had an excuse. Choir practice ran longer than expected, a prayer group meeting went overtime, or she had to help Pastor Mercer with an urgent church matter. At first, Zion accepted her explanations, but soon they started to sound rehearsed. He noticed how she never invited him to join her for these late-night church activities, always assuring him that it wasn't necessary. One evening, Zion decided to surprise her. He drove to the church, expecting to find her in one of the meeting rooms. But when he arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. The lights inside the main hall were off, and there was no sign of Nevaeh. Confused, he called her phone, but she didn't answer. He sat in his car, watching, waiting. After 20 minutes, a car pulled into the lot. His breath caught in his throat as he saw Nevaeh stepping out of the passenger seat of Pastor Mercer's luxury sedan. She smoothed her dress, exchanged a few words with the pastor, then quickly walked toward her own car. Mercer lingered for a moment before driving off. Zion felt his chest tighten. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but his gut told him otherwise. He didn't confront her that night. Instead, he decided to gather more proof. He started paying closer attention, noting every little detail that felt off. A few days later, while Nevaeh was in the shower, Zion took a deep breath and picked up her phone from the nightstand. It was locked, but he had seen her enter her passcode before. His hands trembled as he typed it in, and to his surprise, it unlocked. What he found made his stomach turn. Messages from Mercer filled the screen, some vague, others dangerously intimate. Phrases like, "I can't stop thinking about last night," and "I wish I could hold you longer," jumped out at him, each one a dagger to his heart. There were pictures too, selfies of Nevaeh smiling, posing in ways she had never done for him. Zion felt a mix of rage and heartbreak. He put the phone back exactly as he found it, his mind racing. He could no longer ignore the truth. Something was happening between Nevaeh and Mercer, something that had gone beyond innocent church meetings. But rather than confronting her immediately, Zion decided he needed to catch her in the act. He needed undeniable proof. He wouldn't act on impulse. He would wait, watch, and strike when the moment was right. Zion spent the next few days consumed by a storm of emotions. Betrayal, anger, disbelief. He moved through his daily routine like a ghost, pretending everything was normal while his mind raced with possibilities. He wanted to confront Nevaeh, to demand answers, but deep down, he knew she would lie. She would twist the truth, make excuses, and he would be left with nothing but his suspicions. That wasn't enough. If he wanted to make her and Mercer pay, he needed to be certain. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He began to track her movements more closely. He memorized her schedule, took note of the nights she stayed out late, and studied the way she acted whenever Mercer's name came up. She thought she was being careful, but she had no idea how closely he was watching. Each time she smiled at her phone, each time she left the house in a rush, she fed the fire of his suspicions. Zion knew it was only a matter of time before she slipped up. One evening, Nevaeh told him she had an important church meeting and would be home late. Zion acted as though he believed her, kissing her on the cheek before she left. But the moment the door closed behind her, he grabbed his car keys and followed her. He kept his distance, making sure she never noticed his headlights in the rearview mirror. His heart pounded as he watched her turn onto a familiar road, not the church, but a quiet residential street on the outskirts of town. He knew Mercer lived nearby. Nevaeh pulled into the driveway of a house Zion didn't recognize. The lights inside were dim, the curtains drawn. She stepped out of her car, looking around cautiously before hurrying to the front door. A moment later, it opened, and Pastor Mercer stood there, waiting. He welcomed her inside, shutting the door behind them. Zion sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his fingers ached. His worst fears had just been confirmed, but he wasn't going to storm in. Not yet. He needed more. He needed to catch them in the act. He parked a few houses away and stepped out into the night, moving cautiously toward the house. His heart pounded in his ears as he approached a side window. The blinds weren't fully closed, leaving a small gap. He took a deep breath and peered inside. What he saw made his stomach twist. Nevaeh was in Mercer's arms, their bodies pressed together. She smiled at him in a way she hadn't smiled at Zion in weeks. He watched as Mercer whispered something in her ear, making her giggle like a schoolgirl. Then, as if time slowed to a crawl, she lowered herself onto her knees in front of him. Zion's breath caught in his throat, his vision blurred with rage, his hands trembling at his sides. Every ounce of love he had for Nevaeh shattered in that moment. The woman he had vowed to spend his life with, the woman he had trusted above all else, was betraying him in the most humiliating way possible. And the man who had stood before them on their wedding day, preaching about faithfulness and commitment, was nothing more than a fraud. Zion clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. He wanted to burst through the door, to drag Mercer out and make him suffer. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't the kind of revenge they deserved. He turned away from the window, walking back to his car with a plan forming in his mind. This wasn't just about catching them, it was about making them pay. And when he was done, neither of them would ever forget what they had done to him. Zion barely slept that night. His mind replayed the scene over and over, feeding the rage burning inside him. The betrayal had already been unbearable, but the humiliation made it worse. The woman he had loved, the man he had respected, they had mocked him behind his back, treating him like a fool. He couldn't let it go unanswered. They needed to suffer the same way he had, and he would make sure it was a lesson they never forgot. He spent the next few days planning carefully, making sure every step of his revenge was deliberate. He started by gathering more evidence. It wasn't enough to simply know the truth. He needed undeniable proof. He installed a small camera inside Nevaeh's car while she was asleep, capturing her private conversations and movements. It didn't take long before the recordings revealed what he expected. Whispered phone calls, stolen moments, confessions of love, and worst of all, plans for a future together. Mercer was telling Nevaeh that they just needed to be careful a little longer, that Zion would never suspect a thing. The arrogance in his voice made Zion's blood boil, but rather than confront them, Zion played along. He continued acting like the loving husband, pretending he knew nothing. He kissed Nevaeh goodbye when she left the house, told her he understood when she said she was too tired for intimacy, and smiled as she fed him more lies. She had no idea that every move she made was being recorded. Then he turned his attention to Mercer. Zion knew that exposing an affair wouldn't be enough to ruin a man like him. Mercer had built his entire life around the church, gaining the trust and admiration of the congregation. Zion needed something that would ensure his fall from grace was complete. He started digging into the pastor's finances, calling in favors from a few friends in the banking industry. It didn't take long to uncover suspicious transactions, large sums of money moving in and out of hidden accounts, donations from churchgoers being funneled into personal expenses. Mercer had been stealing from his own congregation, funding his lavish lifestyle under the guise of charity. With both the affair and financial fraud in his hands, Zion was ready to strike. He anonymously sent copies of the evidence to the church, elders, the local news, and even some of the most devoted members of the congregation. Then, he arranged for the final piece of his plan, the ultimate public humiliation. On the following Sunday, Zion walked into the packed church, pretending to be just another devoted husband. Nevaeh sat in the front row, unaware of what was coming, her eyes focused on Mercer as he prepared to deliver his sermon. But before the pastor could speak, the large screen behind him flickered to life. Gasps filled the room as images and videos played, Nevaeh and Mercer together in secret meetings, intimate moments in dimly lit rooms, recorded phone calls where they spoke of their affair in careless whispers. The congregation watched in horror, faces turning pale as they realized the truth. Then, the final blow, evidence of Mercer's financial fraud, exposing him not only as an adulterer, but as a thief who had stolen from the very people who trusted him. The church erupted into chaos. Nevaeh's face drained of color, her hands shaking as people around her pulled away in disgust. Mercer stood frozen in place, his mouth opening and closing like a man struggling to breathe. Zion watched with satisfaction as everything they had built collapsed around them. He didn't need to say a word. He simply stood up, walked out of the church, and left them to face the consequences of their betrayal. His revenge was complete, and he had made sure they would never recover from it. Zion walked away from the church, his heart pounding in his chest, but not from regret, only from the satisfaction of seeing Nevaeh and Mercer crumble under the weight of their own sins. He had exposed them in the most brutal, public way possible, and now there was no turning back. The world knew what they had done, and no amount of apologies or excuses could erase the disgrace they had brought upon themselves. As he drove home, he could still hear the echoes of the church's uproar in his mind, the gasps, the shouts, the accusations being thrown at Mercer and Nevaeh. He imagined the judgmental stares burning into them, the disgust on the faces of people who once admired them. They had spent months deceiving him, thinking they were untouchable, but now they were nothing more than disgraced liars standing in the wreckage of their own betrayal. By the time he pulled into the driveway, he knew that Nevaeh wouldn't be far behind. She had nowhere else to go. Mercer, on the other hand, was finished. The elders would never let him step foot on that stage again, and the law would soon catch up with his financial crimes. Zion didn't need to lift a finger. The people he had fooled for years would tear him apart on their own. Less than an hour later, Nevaeh arrived home, her face streaked with tears, her hand shaking as she stumbled through the front door. Zion watched her with cold detachment as she dropped to her knees, sobbing, trying to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But he wasn't interested in hearing her lies anymore. She had already lost everything. The respect of her friends, the admiration of the church, the future she had foolishly tried to build with another man. And Zion? He had nothing left to give her. Whatever love he had once felt had been buried the moment he saw her on her knees before Mercer. He let her cry, let her plead, but he said nothing. Her words were meaningless now. When she finally realized that nothing she said would change what had been done, she packed a bag and left. She had no choice. She couldn't show her face in the community anymore. Everyone knew what she had done. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow, satisfying punishment for both of them. Mercer's entire career disintegrated overnight. Church members who had once worshipped him now turned against him, calling for his arrest. Investigations into his finances revealed more than just fraud. He had been stealing from widows, from struggling families, from people who had trusted him to lead them in faith. He lost his home, his status, and whatever power he once held over the congregation. When the authorities came knocking, there was nothing left for him to hide behind. Nevaeh, on the other hand, disappeared. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The woman who once held her head high, who had looked at Zion with deception in her eyes, was now a broken, abandoned soul. Zion didn't care where she went. She was nothing to him now, just another lesson in betrayal and consequence. As for Zion, he moved on, but not in the way people expected. He didn't gloat, didn't seek attention for what he had done. He simply started fresh. The pain of betrayal had cut deep, but it hadn't broken him. Instead, it had made him stronger. He had proven that no one, not even the people closest to him, could deceive him without consequences. He had given them all the rope they needed to hang themselves, and in the end, they had done exactly that.